My sister disappeared after I babysat my nephew, then got mad at me for finding him safe childcare. I 36 agreed to babysit my sister's son 8 last Friday night so she could go to a friend's event. My sister Sarah had always been somewhat of a free spirit, which usually meant I was the more responsible one in the family. When she called me that Wednesday asking if I could watch Tommy for the night, I didn't hesitate. We'd grown closer since Tommy was born, and I enjoyed being the fun uncle who could spoil him a bit. "Jake, you're a lifesaver," Sarah had said over the phone. "It's just this one night, and I'll be back first thing in the morning. Promise." I had actually been looking forward to spending time with Tommy. My apartment wasn't exactly kid-friendly, being a bachelor pad with more gaming consoles than proper furniture, but I'd spent the days leading up to Friday carefully planning activities that would keep an 8-year-old entertained. I'd even gone to the store to stock up on his favorite snacks and cleared out my guest room, which usually served as my home office, so he'd have a proper place to sleep. Friday evening started great. Sarah dropped Tommy off around 6 p.m., looking dressed up for what she described as a sophisticated gathering at her friend Madison's house. Tommy was already excited because I'd texted Sarah earlier about having gotten the new Mario game he'd been talking about for weeks. "Now remember," Sarah said as she was leaving, "he needs to be in bed by 9:30, and no sugar after 8. She gave Tommy a quick kiss on the forehead and added, "I'll see you both in the morning, bright and early." Tommy and I had a blast that evening. We ordered his favorite pizza, half pepperoni, half pineapple. The kid had questionable taste, and I let him show me all his new Pokemon cards while we ate. He'd inherited his mother's gift for Gab, chattering away about school and his friends and how Jenny from his class had brought her bearded dragon for show and tell last week. After dinner, we played video games for a while. I pretended to be worse at Mario than I actually was, letting him win just enough to keep it interesting but not so much that he'd catch on. Around 8:30, we started winding down with some hot chocolate. Sugar rule be damned, I was the fun uncle after all, and watched an episode of that nature documentary series he'd been obsessed with lately. Something about deep-sea creatures that honestly gave me the creeps, but Tommy was fascinated. Getting him to bed was surprisingly easy. He'd had such a full evening that by 9:30, he was actually ready to sleep. I'd set up the guest room with fresh sheets and even found my old night light from the storage closet, just in case. Tommy had brought his favorite stuffed dinosaur, a well-worn T-Rex named Mr. Chomps, and was out like a light within minutes of his head hitting the pillow. I stayed up for a few hours after that, catching up on some work emails and watching a movie with the volume low. Around midnight, I got a text from Sarah saying the event was going great and thanking me again for watching Tommy. I replied with a quick photo of Tommy sleeping peacefully and told her everything was fine. Saturday morning, I woke up around 7:30 a.m., expecting to hear from Sarah soon. Tommy was still asleep, so I took the opportunity to start preparing a proper breakfast. The kid had mentioned loving French toast, so I'd made sure to buy all the ingredients the day before. I even had some fresh berries to make it extra special. By 8:30, Tommy was up and absolutely thrilled about the French toast. We ate breakfast together, and he told me all about this weird dream he'd had involving Mr. Chomps coming to life and taking him on a submarine adventure. I checked my phone periodically, expecting to see a message from Sarah about picking him up, but there was nothing. When 9 a.m. rolled around and I still hadn't heard anything, I sent her my first text, "Hey, what time should we expect you?" Her response came quickly, "On my way." It was vague, but I figured she'd be there soon enough. Tommy and I cleaned up from breakfast, and I suggested we build a blanket fort in the living room, something I used to love doing at his age. He was completely on board with the idea, and soon my living room was transformed into an elaborate construction of sheets, cushions, and chairs. We spent the next couple of hours in our fort, reading comics I'd saved from my childhood and making up stories about superheroes. Tommy had quite the imagination, creating this whole elaborate tale about a superhero whose power was turning vegetables into candy, clearly inspired by his ongoing negotiation with his mother about eating his greens. Around 11 a.m., I was starting to get a bit concerned. I had plans later. My friend Mike was having a housewarming party, and I'd promised to help set up since I'd missed his actual moving day the week before. I sent Sarah another text, "Hey, just checking in. I have plans at 3, so hoping you'll be here soon." Her response, "Be there soon," was frustratingly nonspecific, but I tried to stay positive. Tommy and I had lunch, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, another of his favorites, and then spent some time drawing. He was working on a detailed picture of our blanket fort, complete with a flag on top and what appeared to be a moat filled with sharks around it. By 1 p.m., my anxiety was really starting to kick in. I'd been checking my phone constantly, but there was nothing from Sarah. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. I left what I hoped was a calm-sounding message, Hey Sarah, just wondering about your ETA. Remember I mentioned having plans at 3, so I need to know when you'll be here. Please call me back. Tommy, bless his heart, seemed completely content. He'd found my old Lego collection in the closet. I'd been saving it for just such an occasion, and was busy building what he described as a robot dinosaur spaceship. I sat with him for a while, helping him find the pieces he needed and marveling at his creativity, all while trying to hide my growing frustration with his mother. Around 2 p.m., I tried Sarah again. Still no answer. I sent more texts, each one a little more urgent than the last. Tommy was starting to pick up on my anxiety, asking more frequently when his mom was coming. I did my best to keep him distracted, suggesting we play some more video games, but I could tell he was getting worried. By 2:30, I was really starting to stress. Mike had already texted asking where I was, as I was supposed to be helping him set up the sound system for the party. I'd promised to be there early since I was the only one who knew how to properly configure his new speakers. I tried Sarah one more time, leaving a slightly more pointed voicemail about how this was becoming a serious issue. That's when I remembered that Mrs. Chen, our family friend, lived just 2 floors down. She'd been in the building for as long as I could remember and had often watched both Sarah and me when we were kids. She was practically family, and more importantly, Tommy knew her well. They often chatted in the elevator, and she always had cookies for him when they ran into each other. I spent the next hour trying to decide what to do, calling Sarah repeatedly and getting increasingly worried. Finally, at 3:30, after what felt like the 100th unanswered call, I made the decision to reach out to Mrs. Chen. I felt terrible about it, but I was already late for Mike's party, and Sarah's behavior was completely unacceptable. I called Mrs. Chen, and she answered on the second ring. "Jacob. How lovely to hear from you." I explained the situation, feeling increasingly awkward as I did so. But Mrs. Chen, being the angel she is, didn't hesitate for a second. "Of course I'll watch Tommy. Bring him down, I just finished baking cookies anyway." "Hey buddy," I said to Tommy, who was still working on his robot dinosaur spaceship, "how would you feel about hanging out with Mrs. Chen for a little while? Mom's running late, and I have to help Uncle Mike with something important." Tommy looked up from his Legos, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Is Mom okay?" "She's fine," I assured him, though I was starting to have my doubts. "She's just running really late, and I have to go help Uncle Mike. You know Mrs. Chen, right? She mentioned something about fresh cookies." His face lit up at the mention of cookies, and he nodded. I helped him pack up his things, making sure he had Mr. Chomps in his backpack. I even packed some of the Legos he'd been playing with, knowing Mrs. Chen wouldn't mind. We went down to Mrs. Chen's apartment, and she welcomed us with her characteristic warmth. Her apartment always smelled like fresh baking and tea, and today was no exception. Tommy immediately spotted the cookies cooling on the rack in her kitchen and seemed to forget any anxiety about the situation. I gave Mrs. Chen all of Sarah's contact information, apologizing profusely for the imposition. "Jacob," she said, patting my arm, "I've known you since you were smaller than Tommy here. Go help your friend. We'll be fine." I hugged Tommy goodbye, promising to check in later, and finally headed out to Mike's place. I was already over an hour late, and the party was supposed to start at 4. The whole drive there, I kept checking my phone at red lights, hoping to see something from Sarah, but there was nothing. Mike was understanding about my lateness once I explained the situation, though we had to rush to get the sound system set up before guests started arriving. I tried to enjoy the party, but I kept checking my phone and texting Mrs. Chen for updates. Finally, at 4:45, I got a text from Mrs. Chen saying Sarah had called and was on her way. She finally showed up at Mrs. Chen's apartment at 5 p.m., looking hungover and defensive. Mrs. Chen later told me that Sarah had barely thanked her, just grabbed Tommy and his things and left in a hurry. I was still at Mike's party when my phone started blowing up with angry texts from Sarah. According to her, I had abandoned my nephew and betrayed her trust. She was disappointed in my lack of responsibility and couldn't believe I'd pawned her son off on a neighbor. I stepped outside to take her call when it came, trying to keep my voice down despite my growing anger. "Are you seriously mad at me right now?" I asked, incredulous. "You said you'd be back in the morning. It's 5 p.m., Sarah. You ignored my calls and texts all day. You should have waited." She shot back. "I trusted you with Tommy, and you just left him with someone else because you had a party to go to?" "First of all," I said, trying to stay calm, "it wasn't just someone else. It was Mrs. Chen, who's known us both since we were kids. Second, I had plans that you knew about, and I gave you plenty of warning. I tried reaching you for hours." "Family comes first, Jake," she said, her voice dripping with disappointment. You should have cancelled your plans. What if something had happened? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Something did happen, Sarah, you disappeared for hours without any explanation. You didn't answer your phone, you didn't respond to my messages about having plans, and you left me in an impossible situation. And now you're mad at me? The conversation devolved from there, with Sarah insisting I should have just waited indefinitely and me trying to explain how unreasonable she was being. She eventually hung up on me after saying she needed time to think about whether she could trust me again. I went back to the party, but my mood was shot. Mike, being the good friend he is, poured me a drink and let me vent about the whole situation. A few other friends who overheard were equally incredulous at Sarah's behavior, which made me feel a bit better about my decision. Later that night, I got a text from Mrs. Chen. Tommy was a perfect gentleman. We had cookies and he told me all about the robot dinosaur spaceship he was building at your place. Don't worry too much about Sarah, she'll come around once she's had time to think about it. The next day, I got a series of texts from Sarah, still angry but now mixing in guilt trips about how I'd made her look like a bad mother and undermined her authority with Tommy. I decided not to respond right away, needing time to process my own feelings about the situation. Tommy, however, sent me a message through Sarah's phone thanking me for the best sleepover ever and asking when he could come back to finish his robot dinosaur spaceship. That, at least, made me smile. A week has passed now, and Sarah's still giving me the cold shoulder. Our mom called yesterday to try to mediate the situation, but Sarah's convinced I'm completely in the wrong. Mom, for her part, seems to be on my side but is trying to stay neutral for the sake of family peace. The whole situation has left me feeling guilty and frustrated. I love being an uncle, and I hate that this might affect my relationship with Tommy. But I also can't help feeling that I made the best decision I could in an impossible situation that Sarah created. Mrs. Chen keeps telling me to give it time, that Sarah will eventually realize she was in the wrong. She's probably right. Sarah has always had a pattern of getting defensive when called out on her behavior, then eventually coming around once she's had time to reflect. But this time feels different, like I've somehow crossed an unforgivable line in her eyes. The irony is that Tommy had such a great time that he's been asking to come over again. Sarah forwarded me his drawings from school. Apparently, he drew our blanket fort and wrote a story about it for his creative writing assignment. His teacher was apparently very impressed with his vivid imagination in describing the shark-filled moat. I'm writing this all down partly to process it, partly to have a record of what actually happened when Sarah inevitably tries to rewrite history. I know I didn't abandon Tommy, I left him with a trusted family friend when his mother put me in an impossible situation. But Sarah's reaction has made me question everything, and I can't help but wonder if I should have just cancelled my plans and waited it out, no matter how long it took. For now, I'm giving Sarah space to cool down, hoping she'll eventually see reason. I've saved all our text exchanges from that day, just in case. Mrs. Chen has offered to back me up if needed, though I hope it doesn't come to that. I miss Tommy and hope this doesn't affect our relationship long term. He's a great kid who deserves better than being put in the middle of adult drama. The Legos are still sitting in my guest room, the robot dinosaur spaceship half finished. I'm keeping them there, hoping Tommy will get to come back and finish his creation someday. Until then, I'm trying to figure out how to repair things with Sarah without enabling her behavior or accepting blame for a situation she created. The whole experience has made me realize that sometimes being the responsible one means making difficult decisions that others might not understand or appreciate. I just hope that eventually, Sarah will see that I was trying to do what was best for everyone in a situation where there were no perfect solutions.